בלו"ז של הכנס. הנושא שלנו על השקעות משפיעות, השקעות אימפקט ושינוי אקלים ופיתוח בר קיימא, כל איך שזה מתקשר עם משקיעים מוסדיים. הרעיון זה בגדול, זה בעצם, כפי הכותרת, זה לממן רעיונות וטכנולוגיות שיכולים לגשר את פערי ההון והשקעת הון בתוך פיתוח בר קיימא. I'm going to switch over to English now for our guests here. We have some translating materials if you need them and would like them. This is a very exciting area. Impact investment is this notion of investing with intent, an intent that can be measured back to the investors in terms of the impact, in terms of jobs, environment, or any other type of social, environmental risk mitigation that takes place in order to secure returns at a profitable level and returns. So what do we, this notion of intent is quite important. My advanced thing is not working. So what do we know about this notion of combining sustainable development and climate change? We know that there has been a major structural shift in the demand and aggregate demand that is pushing us into that direction. Demographics between developed and developing economies, large financing gaps for climate change, and what happened at COP21 last year in Paris and 22 in Marrakesh just a month ago, in terms of the discussion about the implementation of things to basically save the planet. The notion of these Sustainable Development Goals, which were passed at UN meetings in Addis Ababa last summer in 2015, which were preceded by a series of roundtables and definitions and a process within the UN that many of our panelists and I was very honored to be part of as well, in terms of how you actually finance the development of these implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, which replace the Millennium Development Goals of 2000, and for the next 15 years, how we are able to really create development. So these two sides are really two sides of the same coin, as the Secretary General of the UN has often said. And those two sides of the same coin have to generate returns in order to pay for the long-tail liabilities of the rest of the world. How do we fix this problem of these yield gaps of unfunded contingent liabilities for pension funds and institutional investors, these liabilities that are a drag on stock prices, and on the value of pensions and their ability to pay out their obligations? How do we fix it in terms of coming up with innovative sustainable development finance that's needed to develop financing mechanisms, mobilize pools, aggregate pools, large pools of capital, and also government investment to identify and support these impact investments for sustainable development? This is crucial to the assets of global pension, of the $80 trillion that are managed by global pension and insurance funds, to bridge sustainable development and climate change goals and finance the future. Accelerate our economic growth in a way that does actually meet the generational challenges that we're facing. Now, what's that structural change? Every time, as long as I've studied capital markets and finance, the very first thing where you see innovative financing emerges when there's some structural change in aggregate demand. If it's in terms of rice production in the 11th century of Japan, or if it's in terms of the emergence in the 17th century of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange and financing trade. All of these are building railroads. All of these types of experiences were key. Now, what happened here just a few years ago was an inversion of aggregate demand as the developing world, actually, and the emerging and frontier markets actually surpassed the advanced economies. And you saw this somewhat in the charts yesterday from The Economist as well. And they changed. This happened one other time in economic history since the Industrial Revolution, and it was at the end of the 19th century when the new world surpassed the old world in structural in GDP shares. So that's a very critical shift. So it might have always been a good idea to take care of issues of Africa or India where global poverty existed. Now there's no choice. If you want to have your long-tail liabilities for pension funds and for health liabilities paid for, there have to be returns and a higher level of productivity of those economies and returns from those economies that pay for those benefits. The other factor is is there a demographic dividend or a demographic bomb waiting for us in these next 15 years? has categorized countries that's based on this notion of a demographic dividend of their age structure, where they get rapid change in terms of the working age population. So in demography and looking at labor economics, you've got the whole question about what are age-related specific cohorts, and what is their position in the jobs in the structure. So here you look at pre-dividend countries, in other words, in terms of job creation and the capital investment needed to generate those jobs. Countries that have age structures that are lower, we're fortunate here in Israel, we've got about an 11% savings rate, an age structure that allows us to do that and to move into a serious position in terms of making investments like that. But that's dependent upon us moving up the scale in the OECD in terms of our labor productivity, which was the topic of a panel yesterday here at the conference. The low post-dividend countries need productivity gains, or post-dividend countries need to have sustainable support systems for the elderly. It's an obvious thing that we all know about life. It's hard to figure this out when you're young, but you get older, you realize this is basically the productivity versus age, and this happens to all of us. But the dependency ratios between those age-related cohorts in the demography are very key, and you can see the difference here between developed countries and developed and less developed regions in economies, and again, this importance of doing it. The other big structural change is this issue of climate change scenarios. This just shows you, and we'll talk more about this, but you look at the 100-year visualization charts of temperature change and the projected change in average temperature between 2071 to 2099 compared to 1970 to 1999 requires rapid reductions in emissions and concentrations in order for us to keep the planet alive. The climate change investment financing gap is another one to look at. We moved from basically a need of an annual average of $367 billion is what's currently been invested in that, to scaling up, and we can talk about the amounts here, to around a 5.7 trillion annually. And we'll hear more about that. The other side of the question, again, two sides of the same coin, climate change and sustainable development goals, is this is an analysis that was done by Citi in terms of looking at what there's a $3 trillion annual gap there in terms of closing the map. This was prepared for some work in teaching that we do between the IFC. You might have been to Oster and Shermaninsky and Eugene Kindle's session yesterday on agri-technology, and these issues are very key. Obvious things, and what are these sustainable development goals? No poverty, be able to, whoops, see, there should have been some animation there, right? Do they come? No. Well, there should have been animation here. We can look at each one of these here in Israel and see where we have some competitive advantage, and it happens to be in areas like food or water, or dealing with energy issues, or with health issues. These are key targets of the National Economic Plan and Strategy in terms of creating knowledge-based capital exports, which will drive the growth in this country, and have driven the growth in this country over the last 30 years with the ICT sector, and now our big challenge is transferring that into applications in these other key technologies. The other issue that comes up is the question about stranded assets. There's over $2 trillion in capital expenditures that are going to need to be spent on projects in order to get to these goals. The problem being, though, in a lot of the fossil fuel areas, in order to meet these goals, many of the things that are on the balance sheets of corporations, of energy corporations, will not be able to be extracted. And so there's this yield gap in terms of for institutional investors as a source of capital. You can see going into negative interest rate environment, we'll talk about that. Low interest rates have influenced the liabilities of pension funds and annuity providers, since the liabilities are depending on the discount rate that's used to calculate the present value for future promises. So low interest rates also influence the future value of savings because fixed securities are often a big part of the investment portfolio. So dealing with this problem is the main one. And the other question is just what we have in terms of unfunded contingent pension liabilities and the impact that has on corporations and on their market capitalization and in analyzing what the risk is. So how do we come up with structured finance and outcome-based models that can have an impact on this? We're going to be talking about that. Here's an example we've been trying to work with a little bit here in terms of a green bond fund, a government decision that was made last September to start to create that. We've worked on it in green building finance at the Millikan Innovation Center at the Jerusalem Institute with partners at the Ministry of Environmental Protection, who I believe are here with us today, and the Ministry of Finance. So these ministries are initiating environmental assessments and to set aside a portion of bond proceeds that would provide a limited first loss guarantee. These are the types of structures that we'll be talking about in more detail. I'm going to invite our panelists up here right away. Professor Yuda Kahana from Tel Aviv University and the YKCenter, also a high-tech entrepreneur in his own right. Yeah, come on up. Then, followed immediately in our lineup by Anikat Shah, who is program leader for financing the Sustainable Development Initiative at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, also works at Investec Asset Management, so that's a day job, and getting a PhD at Oxford University. Angela Homsey, who is an impact investor herself, worked at the Generation Fund. We'll hear more about her background, and it's in her bio with Al Gore and Bloom, and Stream Fund that's been doing very well, and then most recently working on some actual projects in Africa that we want to talk about. Dr. Roger Stein, great colleague, joins us from the MIT Financial Engineering Laboratory and NYU Stern School. He's been part of our financial innovations laboratories over the years, and we'll hear a little bit about that. And also Ron Borot, who is joining us from DLA Piper, who's been working with the group at MIT and the Cancer X process. We're going to hear more about. And then last but not least, the most important person that can make this happen on our panel, the Ministry of Finance representative from the Division of Savings and Investments and the Capital Markets, Anat Fire, who has been gracious enough to join us and will ask questions at the end. And I just have to say this, she's also been a wonderful supervisor for some of our fellows, some of our Milken fellows that go into the civil service program, approved program that we run at the Institute. So let's go ahead. I'll just start it off with you, Yehuda. What action do you think we need to take? And how soon do we need to take it?
Okay, I'll talk about it. Can you give me Okay, I'll speak in English because all the members of the panel are speaking English.
We'll also have some here.
I'm calling for action because on behalf of really the millennials, because of some threats that we are facing right now. So I'll start with okay. The world has developed tremendously fast in the last 4 decades, and while we have tremendous economic growth, at the same time we have a growth of substantial threats on the environmental and societal side. Everybody that sits here knows about that there are environmental threats, so I'd just like to emphasize 3 points to show what happens in these days. In these days, we get the following things. First of all, in August, there was a report by Professor Hansen that shows that the sea streams in the sea, in the oceans, are changing rapidly and are causing now big changes, much faster changes than were expected. Then, in the end of October, there was another report on the world situation, which gives a very alarming picture. And the last one, I'd like to show this slide that was published just at the end of November, on November 29th, Kaftet November, that shows this picture. It shows the area of the seas that are covered by ice, and but every year for the last 40 years. The red line at the bottom, I hope you can see it from the distance, is showing what's happening in 1916, today, month by month, okay? It's amazing thing, alarming. 1/3 less area covered with ice in both poles, which means that if we shall continue this way, within just a few years there will be no ice in the North Pole anymore. Then we have, at the same time, we have also big societal issues. I like to emphasize from all of these issues that are mentioned here, I like to mention the last one, which is the retirement security. Millennials are not saving. Due to the changes in the interest rates, since the crisis of 2008, the interest rate is very low all around the world, around zero. At this rate of interest, there is no preference for the future, and people are indifferent, and they are preferring to spend all their money now, and they don't save. That means that it's a major threat to retirement security. So I like to mention, deal mainly with these issues here. Unfortunately, I got the presentation here is much longer than the one that was planned to be, and I'll skip some of the slides. But here is a slide that shows that human society, as one of the historians, Toynbee, said, that societies do not vanish because of murder. They vanish because they commit suicide. And I hope that we are not committing suicide here. The UN has just recently estimated that in order to bridge the gap, we need to invest about 9% of global GDP every year for the next 15 years. These are huge amounts that should be of a major concern. The problem is that many leaders, most leaders as a matter of fact, and also many of the executives are ignoring the risks and or unaware of the risks. I don't know why, but they are focusing mainly on the short term. Short-termism is the problem. That's the reason why I made a comment at Richard Quest session that yesterday, that they're talking about very important things which are really petty things in comparison to the major long-term threats that we are facing. So really, we have to call for action. And in order to be able to solve the issues that we are talking about, to have those trillions of dollars every year invested in preventing these risks, we have to do something really drastic, because most people are still thinking in terms of millions or billions, and we have to talk now in terms of trillions, which is X times, 1,000 times what the scale that we are still used to speak about and deal with. So this is a major issue here, and it requires really a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift really involves, first of all, involves a change in the metrics. We can still handle it with the current metrics, but we have really to change the metrics. All the economies now are geared toward the maximization of economic values, and we have to reach different measures, different metrics, because what we measure is not the past result, but what we measure is the future, is the goal. It sets the compass, and it's very important. So we are talking about a new dashboard, a multidimensional. There are attempts already to do it. The OECD, for example, has declared a few years ago well-being indicators, and the United Nations have shown the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals, the 17 goals in April this year. And then the other question is where to get the funds from. In the old days, when I was a child, I was interested in adventure stories, finding treasures of pirates, etc. And right now, I think that we found the source of that can be done, the source that can be used. The source is really, the only sources for long-term investments in the world are retirement funds. It could be public funds, it could be the social security system on one hand, and it could be also the private savings for retirement, because this is the only source of long-term investments. It's interesting that the insurance industry and the retirement industry, insurance and pension and whatever, are dealing with these risks and are already managing for us a portfolio of about $80 trillion. So we are talking in the right numbers now, okay? So the question is how to channel some of these money to that direction. I'm skipping some slides, and really the major issue is how to move some of these monies into the impact investments in the other in the other aquarium. There are differences in the ways in which the public sector and the private sector looks at investments. The public sector sees indirectly sometimes, it doesn't measure always the results, but it sees the benefits. Most of the benefits of the investments are indirect. Investment, impact investment in environmental projects are bringing indirect results. Change, improvement in health, prevention of pollution, etc., etc. But this is not monetized. It's not, these are, from the private point of view, the private investor's point of view, these are just externalities and they're not counted in your benefits. So the main result is we have to find ways to internalize these externalities if we want the private money to flow. This can be done directly, it could be done indirectly, and there are ways. I have some ideas about it, but the forum here are experts, the best experts in the world really, and they can find the ways to do. We are working on it in the last 2 days, and tomorrow also we're going to work trying to find some solutions. Some of the solutions are old solutions that have been tried already in the world of different purposes, for example, the Marshall Plan or whatever. And some plans were used in Israel even for many years. For all the first decades of Israel, we diverted really most of the retirement monies to development budget of Israel. And so there are all kinds of solutions. By the way, the public itself, the crowd, is also pushing to that direction right now. And this is done through the call of many people in the world already that say, well, we are pensioners or we are saving for pension plans. Please invest the money where we like it to be invested, and put it in only in green investments and whatever, in impact investment. So there are all kinds of solutions already. The basic idea really is the call for action that I'm having here is to try to hit 2 targets with the same arrow. First of all, to solve the retirement security issue by making sure that people are saving, and for that they have to get the right yield on their investments through the retirement funds and insurance companies, and through the social security, and at the same time to find the trillions of dollars that are needed for impact investments. So we solved two issues. The only comment that I like to make here, Ed Cole once said that you don't drown by falling into the water. You drown if you stay too much below the water. So let's not stay too much below the water because we are already there and it's a big threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Both a call to action and also framing the question around the climate change goals and how we carve a channel of capital to provide returns into that area. Let's shift over to a discussion of the sustainable development goals, which is the other side of this coin. And we have with us Anika Shah, who has been thinking about this and working on it professionally for quite a while. How do we do this? What do we need to mobilize in terms of financial institutions, be they development financial institutions or conventional ones, to work on this?
Great, thanks very much. Can you hear me? Great. So I think we're just waiting for the slides to be put up, but I'll start my remarks with what I think is the central paradox of this whole sustainable development challenge. And I think that paradox is best articulated by E.O. Wilson, who said, the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And I think if an alien came from Mars and saw, on the one hand, the extraordinary technology that humanity has, we learned about a lot of this yesterday and during some of the panels, the abundance of capital, both public and private, if we wanted to, and Yehuda just mentioned some numbers, and I can mention some others about just the scale of potential resources that exist in this world, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you have 1.2 billion people living under $1 a day still. You have what we've now known, not just for the last few years, but I would say for the last few decades, and some would argue hundreds of years, of an enormous environmental and ecological problem that we actually know how to solve and we know how to finance, but we're unable to do so, or we have been so far unable to solve the problem. So to me, because I've worked on this problem both on the private side at a large asset management firm that had hundreds of billions of dollars of capital that it was managing, and constantly thinking about where do we actually invest this money. You know, it's this weird thing, right? You say, oh, I don't know where to actually put this money. And on the other hand, you have all these needs in the world. For me, the big conclusion was, number one, confusion, but also number two, that we need to have better intermediaries that link the global saving with the global demands. And that if we can actually build or refurbish those types of institutions, and by that I mean the entities that match capital with needs, we can actually get to where we want to go. So I only have 8 minutes left, so I'm going to have to go very quickly, but I'll start with really my 5 main messages, and so you can then you can tune out for the rest of the 7.5 minutes. The first is that the SDGs need to be considered more than marketing. And for me, they should be turned into long-term investment plans for each country and region. That we have to turn these 17 goals into functional, operational plans with financing that's attached to them. And if we don't do that, my view is, and what history shows, is that the SDGs will die as a useful framework for international development. Number two is what we all know, but it's worth restating, that there is no shortage of global capital to finance the SDGs, public or private. That is not a binding constraint at all. If anyone thinks that it is, I would love to debate that with them, because we simply have more than enough capital that we need. So that the problem is not on the capital side. Number three is what I mentioned before, that we need properly scaled and well-functioning investment institutions. By that, I mean, and this presentation will focus on development finance institutions, but it's true for impact investment firms, it's true for pension funds, it's true for insurance companies, and so on. We need to focus on how these institutions operate, their governance, their purpose, and so on. And if we do that, I think we can make significant progress. Fourth, as I mentioned, is that development banks are a proven institution that can leverage public capital with private saving. And five, I end with some ideas of how to do so. So we've been hearing a lot about investment gaps in the two presentations before that. And what my organization did was we actually went and costed the SDGs at a global level and also for low-income and lower middle-income countries. And what I can tell you is the answer, the amount of capital that we're seeking is not out of the realm of possibility. It's between $1 to $2 trillion additional, so incremental investment per year globally, which you might say is a lot of money, but I'll respond by saying we have a $110 trillion per annum global economy. We have $300 trillion in global financial assets. We have $22 trillion per annum in additional saving that comes onto the market every year and so on. So again, the binding constraint to me is not capital. And if any of you are interested in going through these numbers in more detail, hopefully we can send this deck to folks. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that the SDGs need to be turned into investment plans for each country and for each region. And by that I mean the following. We have to take each one of these goals, we should cost them, we should see what the investment gap is, and then we should see how to fill them up. And if we don't do that type of analysis, by the way, that analysis was done for the Millennium Development Goals and it was very helpful in many countries in Africa, for example. If we don't do that with the SDGs, my view is that this will go down just like Agenda 21 in the 90s at the UN. It'll be just another nice message, but won't actually have an impact in mobilizing capital. And if you do this type of planning, you actually see it's a really aha moment for planning commissions, development finance institutions, for folks sitting on the public side. Because you can tell them, look, you've signed on to these goals, this is how much they cost, this is how much the different sectors can actually mobilize by themselves, this is the gap and this is what we need to fill. And it's a very useful way of actually mobilizing public and private capital. The second point I want to make is around the lack of shortage of capital in this world. And there are many ways of making this point, but we live in this very strange time when we have around $11 trillion in negative real yielding sovereign bonds. Which is, if you take a moment to think about how strange that is, you're lending money knowing you're going to have less money in return. And I simply don't believe, and you're going to hear later on of wonderful work that Angela is doing and others on real investment opportunities that exist, that provide real return to investors, but it just requires a little bit of creativity and smart thinking. You're going to hear that from actually all the panelists. So we can turn this 11 trillion negative yielding bonds into productive investments. It just requires a little bit of work to do so. Where my mind and my work has taken me, and it's also partly because where I'm currently sitting professionally, is to the role of institutions, and particularly to the public financial institutions that have played a tremendous role throughout economic history, but in my view are underappreciated and underrepresented in the discourse today. I think it'll be very tough to make a big push for public institutions given the fact that there is so little trust in government in many places in the world. And I'm an American, and witnessing the last 18 months in the US, regardless of the election outcome, the real fatality was a continuing decline in the institutions that guide our country. We'll skip that for the time being. So I'm ending my presentation with a call for a revitalization and an upgrading of development banks at all levels. Because in my opinion, the development banking community, they are the one type of institution that we know can leverage public capital with private saving. And this table just shows the amount of shareholder capital that has been put in to the large multilateral development banks over the last 70 years or so. And the number on the right is basically many folds the number on the left. And what development banks do, as you know, is that they take the very high credit rating that they have and use the shareholder capital to then issue very cheap debt on public markets and use that to finance development. And what we know right now is that the S&P, for example, did a very good study recently that MDBs can lend an additional $1 trillion if they wanted to and still keep their credit rating. So the analysis has been done, the work has been done, but this needs the political will to move forward. The last point, and then I'll finish, is that I really think a lot more focus should be put on national development finance institutions and the architecture of national development finance to push forward the SDGs. Remember, ultimately, the SDGs are signed on by governments. They're not signed on by businesses, although many of them have agreed in concept and in spirit. They're not signed on by regulators, although many regulators, again, agree with the spirit of them. This is a government agenda, which will only be reached with the private sector. Don't get me wrong there. But what I'm saying is that we need an upgrading of the development finance institutions and architecture that can allow private capital to flow, that can do the risk mitigation, that can do the credit enhancement, that can structure projects and so on. And this is a large topic, and it touches on many of the points that we're going to hear afterwards. But my big push again is for us to look at these institutions with the perspective of how we can upgrade them to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much.
Great. That's very helpful anecdote in terms of framing this opportunity and how important it really is. And it's an auspicious time here in Israel. The Prime Minister was with his team down in Africa. We have an Africa panel later this afternoon that I hope you'll all come back for as well, where we'll continue this discussion on a particular geography, very important geography. And if you go back to those structural demands for capital and the changes that are going on, if we want to have customers over the next 15 years, we're going to be getting them from developing economies. If we want to see growth in our own economy, as a developed country now, we have to tie our faith there. Let me turn this over to my colleague Roger Stein, who has been working in this area quite a bit. We're going to shift the questions over. We got to answer partially on the institutional side the how question. But Roger is one of the country's world's great financial engineers in terms of looking at structures and oops, let's see. Oh, I'm going to Angela. Excuse me, my mistake. You were just next in line. Let me turn it over to Angela as an investor, and then we'll go back. Then we'll drill down into the structuring questions. Pardon me for that. So Angela has mentioned in her introduction, has been working on the ground in Africa and other countries as well, focusing on impact investing. How do you understand this question, and how do you do it?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I wanted to start with telling you a little bit about where my understanding of the sector comes from and of the bottlenecks and solutions that can be applied to try to solve the issues that we've talked about earlier. I'm Egyptian, Lebanese, Israeli. It starts with a pretty explosive mix, and clearly the SDGs have been at the core of my life since I was pretty much born, with all the different problems that are part of that background, and as well a lot of cynicism about how to deal with it. So for me, I've always tried to understand through different paths, how can you bring the hard-hearted capital owners and investors to come to finance these different issues that are so critical for all of us. I've done it through mainstream investment banking, which is Goldman Sachs, which I would call these bad impact investments. So it's not positive impact, but it's more negative impact. Through pure impact, social impact investing, as well as what I call sustainable investing, which is basically using institutional money to fund businesses globally that are doing something that has a positive outcome on some of the global challenges that we've mentioned. And that was with gore and blood, as Glenn said. Quickly realizing that out of all these different words and notions, impact, sustainability, philanthropy, the way to actually bring the large amount of capital, the large sums of money that are there to this field and to being aligned with better outcome, social and environmentally, you need to be at that cross-section of sustainability and impact, which means you need to fund business models that are scalable, that make risk-adjusted return for investors, and that provide basically, on a purely economic basis, a good proposition to a capital provider, at the same time as solving for the social and environmental issues and the SDGs that were mentioned earlier. So I call that sustainable impact investing, but hopefully very soon we won't need to have the sustainable impact definition or adjective, but it will be just like a smart way of investing money. And that's what we need to get to. There is challenges, but how do we provide to the financial system a solution and opportunities, investment opportunities, that make them irrelevant of wanting to do good. It's just about investing smartly with the right type of assessment of risk and the right type of understanding of opportunities in front of us, so that financial returns are aligned with doing a positive outcome on the world. So I wanted to touch base. I have only 2 slides, so not a lot to look at. That's the first one, and the second one will be after. I wanted to touch base on the different part of the ecosystem of how money has been flowing into solving some of these SDG and sustainable challenges across time, but that all coexist together. We started initially with philanthropists. Philanthropists saw that there was a great need for crucial issues that they care about. Each of them care about different things. And they wanted to allocate some of their money not just to giving charity directly, but to actually giving money in a more revolving way where they would solve some of this issue, get the capital to be leveraged and repatriated into more, and basically get a bit more accountability for the money that they were putting on the ground. That was a great first step because it created more accountability about the way money is being given to solve challenges. That was a very good thing as well because it provided the ability to go into very bold ideas because you don't care about does it really make sense economically or not. You just want to go after what you care about. So that's a high-risk proposition, really. But the problem is, obviously, it didn't create financial return really consistently, so there was a low reward. And the impact ended up being medium, I call that, because you cannot scale it. It's only a small amount of money, and all the philanthropy in the world out there is not enough to solving all the challenges that we mentioned. We need institutional flow that comes partly from government, but from pension funds, from insurance companies, and from other people to go into being aligned with solving the challenges that we have ahead. So then what we saw is the emergence of a new industry, the impact investment industry, which basically was providing some private equity fund structures that were geared towards solving some challenges ahead. And that was enabled by the fact that people realized that you need more professionalism in doing that you need to pull capital together in order to have the right type of resources, research, and number of people working on the issue. And as well by the fact that there was the emergence of standardization, measurement, metrics to understand exactly how do economic return work alongside impact metrics. And that's something that has happened over the past few years that is today, I would say, the norm. That was a great thing because it raised a lot of awareness about how capital can finance sustainable challenges, being climate change or demographics, water issues, medical problems across the world in both developed market and emerging markets. Suddenly all our youth started talking the next generation about how they're going to do impact MBAs or studies, how they all want to do good, that they don't want to think about doing something during the day that is depleting the world and at night give a bit of charity. They really wanted to do it all together. And that's created a big buzz and as well a lot of public awareness. So you and I as consumer started looking at this concept of bringing together our money with our impact. And that was great. But that stayed very suboptimal. That was a medium risk, medium reward, medium impact proposition because nothing was maximized so that basically, the hard-hearted investors could not really find the opportunity to deploy the capital there. And that's when we believed that there was a need, and that's what's happening today, to move from thinking about impact as a different asset class or methodology to something that is actually something that can be applied across asset classes. Something that can be applied for different type of risk and different type of returns, for equity, for bond, for real estate, for different areas. And as Anik had said, there is no lack of capital out there. This is not the problem. The problem is well professionally run and well-structured investment opportunities for this capital to flow in to provide above-market returns, risk-adjusted returns, together with solving some of these SDGs. And that's how I'm going to give you a concrete example quickly about what I mean here, but this is where the huge impact is, because this is where then pension funds and investment funds, together with capital owners generally, cannot shy away anymore from putting their capital to work into that field, like they used to do, as saying, our fiduciary duty prevent us from doing good. No, your fiduciary duty as a good investor, as a good capital owner, is to look into these issues because they are absolutely material to the performance of your investments. It's only by understanding the risk ahead and the opportunities ahead coming from the global challenges that you will make a smart investment decision. So it's really like thinking just what's the right thing to do for my portfolio is really correlated with doing good. I'll give you an example of how we've done it in Africa. In Africa, we've looked at the space of off-grid solar. So I've been looking at a long time at this field of off-grid solar, which is basically solar energy to the rural households and places that are off the grid. Initially, that was about giving energy to poor people in rural areas. So people were thinking, oh, grand people, philanthropists can do it. There's no need for more, these people are poor, let's just give a system away. That created actually a lot of misincentive in the system and a lack of scale, and never scaled up to the right level. So that's where the industry had to move to something that was financed more from pure investment in order to scale up. Impact investor came in, that was great, that created a bit more capital to flow in, but that stayed still like very niche, very subscale, low volume, quite high margin, not very lean business model, and talents that wanted to do good, like people coming into the field wanted to do good, but we're not the more hardcore professional that you want to put their brain to work for solving these issues. That's where Ignite came in. Ignite was a way to look at the sector, to move it to being something that is really large-scale, replicable, that where mainstream institutional capital can flow in because the right structure and risk allocation is put in place, because there's a project finance approach to it, where risk is being allocated according to the type of risk that each investor wants to take. And that enabled us as well, thanks to the scale and thanks to the return opportunity, to attract amazing talent to the journey. Like hundreds of people in several countries in Africa. We started in Rwanda and expanding abroad. And that's what basically enabled for us to get to the next level of providing energy in a clean way to people in the poorest part of Africa in a way that is fully sustainable and financeable through institutional investors. Ignite is one example on how to do it. This is a renewable energy to rural places model. What we believe is this is doable in every sector. In clean tech, in agri-tech, in water tech, in med tech, using innovation, leapfrog economic model, and smart structuring in order to get institutional finance to go and finance profitably opportunities that do good and well at the same time. And that's what we've been doing with the Angaza Innovation Fund, which is replicating that model across sector and investing in smart business opportunities that do good at the same time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've seen in the Ignite case study, which framed the problem here very well, and some of the solutions in the Ignite case study, how it can happen. I'm going to drill into that because what we need to do is have a flow, as Annika has written and said, that the flow of projects needs to accelerate. The deal flow in order to be financed, and this is again a place where the considerations we have right now in trying to build, not just revitalize, but Annika, as you challenged us, but to actually build a development finance platform in this country based on the incredible competitive advantage in terms of technology development. On that, Roger's been spending a lot of time at the engineering lab at MIT, another technology place, to look at structures and flows of capital and how they can build into capital structures that can finance these ideas that can turn into much more productive, high-return projects.
So thanks.
Tell us how to do this.
First, I want to thank Globes for convening this panel, which I think is an important one. Thank Glenn for inviting me. I'm honored to be here with everybody. I want to tell you a little bit about some work that we have been doing at MIT. It's joint work with a number of other people, in particular Andrew Lowe, who heads up the Laboratory of Financial Engineering and who brought me this idea about 5 years ago to work on together. It's an academic idea. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that because it's academic, it's not relevant. But I will tell you that, in fact, the idea is being implemented. Funds have been launched already that use this approach. And I'm aware of another group that's working on a large transaction based on this. And there's government legislation in the US, a bill before Congress, also based on this, this notion of some of the things I'll talk about. And I guess, as Angela was mentioning, there's this notion of sort of evolving a scale, starting with small investments and growing to larger and larger investments to make them mainstream. And I think the thing that we tried to look at was how to go the other way, how to do a single transaction for $1 billion or $2 billion of institutional investors' money to have significant impact. Now, I spent most of my career, in addition to doing teaching, running large quant groups, large research groups on Wall Street. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what the risks of certain types of investments were and what the returns would be and so on. And people would use those tools to make investments. We were very lucky to get good uptake. The issue that we set before ourselves when we approached this problem that I'm going to tell you about was to take the word impact out of the investment. Not because we didn't think it was good to do the impact, but because we thought that the number of people that would be concerned about the particular issue we were working on was relatively small compared with the total number of people that like to make investments. If I want to clear this room out really quickly, I can scream fire, and everyone will run out, right? Now, if I do that every day for a while, you'll stop listening to me. If I put big pots of money out there, I can clear the room out just as quickly, and I can do it over and over again. The goal of what we're trying to do is create the big pots of money to motivate people to do social good. So the problem that we were starting to work on was the following. It's a technology problem, as Glenn mentioned, and the problem was to try to fund early stage research for cancer therapies. And it turns out there's a problem in this domain, and that problem is related to the fact that these investments are very risky. They take a very long time to develop. Individually, they're poor propositions, but when they do pay off, they're extremely profitable. The problem is that no one wants to make a single investment because they're just so risky. So let me give you an example of what this results in. There's the notion in the industry, it's called the valley of death. And on one side of the valley, you've got these laboratories producing really great research. They're doing all this really cool stuff, and they've got really innovative therapies that seem like they might be very helpful and actually save patients' lives. On the other side, you've got large institutional investors and pharmaceutical companies that would love to make these investments, but that don't like the risk that's associated with those early stage projects. For example, an early stage cancer compound, if Glenn had a laboratory and he developed a cancer compound, the likelihood that that would ever become a drug is about 1 in 20. So 95% 93% of the time, he's going to have a failure. However, if he does have success, he's going to get billions of dollars a year. So what happens is as these drugs progress through the life cycle of approval and research, they become less and less risky and more likely to succeed. There's a point at which they become very attractive because the likelihood of success is very high relative to what it would have been, and the returns are high. That space between the early guys, Glenn in his lab with a test tube, and the folks that have all the money that want to fund it, that phase in the middle of all that research that has to happen to prove that these drugs might be successful is called the valley of death in the industry, and that's what we wanted to fix. We wanted to figure out if we could get money in there. The simple approach we took was to just think about portfolio construction and portfolio risk management. It looks like I'm running short on time.
You go ahead.
Okay.
I think that was only was 5 minutes.
Ah, okay, good. I love being in Israel.
Don't stop now.
Right.
Don't get envy.
So we developed this notion of a kind of a security called a research-backed obligation. The basic idea was to start with the idea that you want to raise a lot of money, and to raise that money up front, and to basically fund all of these trials in advance, so that later on you have the money to continue the financing. If you want to get a drug approved in the US, and there are similar processes in Europe and in Israel, you have to go through a series of tests, clinical trials. Each one of these trials is designed to establish a certain property of the drug. So let's say there are 100 different researchers, each one of them has a blue bottle, and each of those blue bottles, just like Glenn, might be a drug that could provide a very good therapy to save lives from cancer, but it's not likely to succeed. So you start out by, in the lab like Glenn did with these 100 trials, these 100 vials, and you then go to test the drug to see if it's going to actually hurt people. There's a large trial that's done with healthy people, just to see if those people will stay healthy when you give them this drug. They don't have to have the disease, but you want to make sure the drug's not going to harm people. Turns out it's not so easy to do, and a lot of those bottles turn out to hurt people, and they're dropped out of the process. They can't be pursued because they're too damaging. They cause liver issues or memory loss or things like that. But if you're successful, you get to move to the next stage, and that stage is to determine whether the drug actually does what it's supposed to. If it's supposed to reduce the size of a tumor, does it actually reduce the size of a tumor? Or does it not do anything? You might have heard of placebo trials and all that. That's what those things are about. It's really to see whether the drug works or not. Again, a lot of drugs don't do what they're supposed to. It turns out that when you test them in real scientific, rigorously controlled situations, they don't do what they're supposed to. If they do, though, you can move on. And if you move on, you have to then determine that the drug not only does what it's supposed to, but it does it better than drugs that exist today. If it doesn't do it better than that drug, a doctor can't prescribe it. It's not ethical to give you something that doesn't work as well as something else that's already available. And it turns out that's also really hard. A lot of drugs drop out. And finally, if you're really good and you're very successful, you can get approval and you can have a drug developed that you can give to patients and hopefully extend life, save lives, and so on. Now what you see here is that out of the 100 drugs you started with, only about 5 or 6 actually make it through. And so the question that an investor has is, if you had the opportunity to buy one of those blue bottles, but I'm not going to tell you which one it is, and you have to wait 10 years to find out whether you have one of the blue ones or not, would you want to do it? And the answer, of course, is no, no one wants to do it. It turns out the average return, the average of all those bottles, is actually really good. But you can't get it most of the time because you picked the wrong bottle. So the trick that we didn't come up with this trick, people got the Nobel Prize for coming up with this trick, but the trick that we applied to these assets was to treat them like real financial assets. Let's not treat them as doing good, but let's treat them as an investment trying to generate some revenue. And when we did that, we looked at the properties of the assets. In the early stages, again, I'm looking at